years. So please help me welcome Scott Harvey.
So that was only about 20 seconds of silence. It got very awkward at about the 10-second mark, and about the 20-second mark, most of you were worried about me. Anything. You came to hear the art of listening, and you were listening, and there was nothing being said. And every one of your explanations within that 20 seconds was not beneficial to me. You thought, did he forget his opening line? Did his slides lock up? Did whatever? Your brain has to make sense of the vacuum that I created. When we have a crisis in the workplace, what do we tend to do? We tend to shut down communications. Because that's what the lawyers tell us. Don't say anything. You can't talk about this. So I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, but I can tell you this. I would venture to say there's not a time where you can't say anything. There are things you shouldn't say, obviously. But here's what I know. Silence without rapport feels like we don't care. Every time. It just does. You didn't know me from Adam when I stepped on this stage, and it got super awkward very quickly, and it felt like I wasn't prepared or something like that. What if I was on your team and you were being silent with me? What if I was a client or a customer of yours and I knew there was an issue and nobody was talking about it? How long before I start feeling like you don't care? The rapport is the secret sauce, though. That's the good news. That's why my wife and I can be on a road trip for hours in the car, and we can spend an hour neither one of us saying anything to the other, and we're not worried that the other one is mad. Because we have thousands of hours of communication and rapport that will support that kind of silence. If silence is damaging our businesses today, and we're going to talk about listening and that kind of stuff, if it's damaging our businesses, why do we do it? Let me explain it to you the best way I know how. I'm not outdoorsy. I know that surprises some of you, but I don't spend a lot of time outdoors, mainly because the outdoors is not air conditioned. That's my biggest issue with the outside. And I sweat when I tie my shoes in the morning, so I'm not a huge fan of sweating outside. And the older I get, the less I like the outdoors in the wintertime because it's cold. I used to never get cold, and now I'm starting to wear cardigans and that kind of stuff because I'm cold a lot. But there was a time when my youngest daughter was 13. My oldest daughter was away at church camp at CIY. And my wife and I were trying desperately to find a way to get our 13-year-old's face out of her phone for at least an hour or two. The parents in the room, you know what I'm talking about, right? So my wife's brother calls and he says, hey, the creek is up because it rained a lot yesterday. If you guys want to go kayaking, you can come down and use my supplies. Now, I've never been kayaking before in my life, but I'm a guy, and that never stopped us from faking it until we make it, right? So I said, absolutely, we'll go kayaking. So we went down to his house. We're loading up the kayaks. We're getting ready to go into the creek. And he tells us, he's like, hey, the life jackets are right over there. And I looked at him, I said, dude, the creek is waist deep at best. I don't think we need life jackets. And my sweet wife's head spun 180 degrees around on her body, and she goes, we are wearing life jackets. So you can see in this picture, my wife in the front, my daughter in the middle, and I am wearing a life jacket too. Because 20-some years into marriage, there's fights you have and fights you don't have. A life jacket is a fight I chose not to have, so I put it on. And while we're loading up, my brother-in-law is explaining about kayaking, and he says, you're going to reach a point in the creek where there's a tree coming from one side, another tree coming from the other side. He said, it's no big deal. My wife and I go around it all the time. I said, okay, like I knew what that meant, and I continued loading kayaks. We're on the creek, a few tragedies averted because my daughter was convinced every bug on the creek was going to eat her. This is the picture that I uploaded to Instagram, by the way, to show everybody in the world what a great dad I am. This represents about 0.5% of the time I spend as a dad, but this is the one to make you jealous of the kind of life we live, okay? So that's the pic that I uploaded, but when we rounded the bend, I could hear the water rushing, and the water was rushing a lot faster than I expected it to be on this creek. But I heard the water before I saw the trees exactly as he described. One from one bank, one from the other. In the middle was a kayak-sized hole. Go around, I thought. Those of you that have ever been kayaking before, apparently go around means paddle to the shore. Get out, carry your boat around the obstruction and set it in the other side. I did not know that. So I told my wife, good luck. And off she went through the kayak-sized hole, a couple of 180-degree turns, and she navigated it like a rock star. Once again, reminding me how I outkicked my coverage years ago when she married me. But then my 13-year-old daughter goes next. I'm about 30 yards behind her. She lined her boat up, turned the wrong way, and washed sideways against the first tree. If you've ever been kayaking or you understand physics, you know what happened next. The water pushed her and her boat underneath that tree. And right before she went underwater, she locked eyes with me, and then she disappeared. Her boat popped up the other side. She did not. So I jumped out of my kayak and I started running in the waist-deep water to where I had last seen her. Still had no idea where she was. The water was pushing me so hard, I knew I had one chance to get this right, otherwise I wasn't sure I could fight the current to get back to where she was. When I got about halfway to where she went under, I saw her elbow wrapped around the tree, and then her face appeared for a second and it disappeared again. So I at least now had a target. So thankfully, I found myself planted right behind her elbow. I reached underneath that tree, grabbed the seams of the life jacket that I didn't think she needed, by the way, and pulled with everything I had. And when I pulled her out, she came face to face with me and she started coughing and water poured out of her. More water than her mouth could hold. It was the scariest thing I've ever seen as a dad. And then she started crying. About that time, my kayak floated up, and my first aid training told me if you were crying, you were breathing. So please keep crying, sweet girl. And I grabbed a hold of my kayak and I set her in it. And when she got control of herself enough to string a sentence together, she looked at me and she said, I just kept telling myself that Daddy's coming. I don't know where her misplaced confidence in my outdoor abilities came from, but she also knew, I've promised her before, there's not a ditch in the world deep enough to keep me out of it if she's in the bottom. So as inept as I might be, I was the only chance she had. And we got home from a kayaking trip, and my wife, being the southern woman that she is, she said, everybody just drop your wet clothes in the garage and hit the showers. I said, I'm going to hit the porch. And I sat on the porch drying off a little bit, dealing with an adrenaline dump that I wasn't quite prepared for because I had almost watched my 13-year-old daughter die due to my ignorance. And when I sat on that porch, I realized the only injuries she had was a couple of bruises and scrapes from holding on to a tree harder than she's held on to anything in her life. And it occurred to me, we do that too. When we have a crisis that turns our whole world upside down, we grab the first safe thing we can find and we hold on to it hard. If you have a crisis at work, it feels really safe to say nothing. And so that's what we do. And when people are like, well, we want to hear about it, we just hold tighter and we struggle to breathe. Here's what I know. Had she not grabbed a hold of that tree, she'd have washed out the other side. Her life jacket would have done its job. She'd have stood up in waist-deep water. But because she held on, it pushed her feet out from under her, and the current pushed her head underwater and put her in a really dangerous spot. Sometimes grabbing what feels safe is what keeps us stuck and struggling to breathe. So if we're going to break the silence, what do we need to know about communication? We need to know this. Depending upon which study you read, you'll get somewhere around these numbers. Our message, about 7% of it is our words. 38% is our tone, 55% is our body language. How does that fare in our text-driven email society? Not good, right? You don't believe these statistics? Let me ask you this. Let's say tonight you connect with somebody here you hadn't seen in years. So as you're getting ready to leave, you text your spouse or significant other, say, I've reconnected with this person. I'm not going to be home tonight. I know you made supper, but I'll be home whenever I get home. And that's what you text them, and this is the response you get back. What's that mean? The guys in the room are like, it means that's great. No, it means it's a trap, guys, okay? Because you're only getting the words, you're not getting the message. The message is in the nonverbals and the tone. If they were in the room with you and you said that, this may be a, that's great. Or it may be a, that's great. Same two words, two very different messages. So if you ever made somebody mad with a text message or a social media post and you can't figure out why they got mad, have them read it back to you. Because you typed it in your tone and they read it in theirs. And I promise you, it's a very different message. When they read it back to you, you'll be like, I didn't write that. And that's exactly what you wrote, just not what you meant. So be very, very careful how you're communicating today. When we are communicating, We need to understand that stress is one of the biggest barriers to communication. This will lead us into our listening discussion, by the way. This is the most useful thing I ever learned as a hostage negotiator. In everybody's brain is a teeter-totter. On one end of that teeter-totter is emotion. And I don't care what that emotion is. Fear, anger, frustration, stress, excitement, whatever. On the other side is logic and reason. So, when emotion is high, logic and reason is low. Every time. Which means when you have an angry customer, an angry client, an angry coworker, and they are highly emotional, you might spit out a very logical Yoda-like solution to their problem and they will blow right past it because their brain cannot process logic and reason when it's in a highly emotional state. So what did I do as a negotiator? Whenever I got on the phone with somebody, they would cuss me, they would yell at me, they would hang up on me, they would threaten me, they would threaten my family. I let them do it. And I would just keep calling back. And I'd get yelled at and hung up on again, and I would call back. And they would yell at me, some very creative things, by the way. And then they would hang up and I would call them back. Because every time they yelled and vented, that emotion would come down. And as emotion comes down, logic and reason will naturally return to the conversation. But what do we want to do? We want to get defensive. And we want to latch on to the first few things they say and start solving a problem that's really not even a problem. It's just they're so frustrated that they're venting. We got to let them vent. We got to listen while they do it. And we've got to encourage them to keep talking. Listening today, I would tell you, is so rare, it's almost like a superpower. You know the people in your life who are not going to listen to you. And you know the people who will listen to you. In a world that is constantly communicating and messages coming from everywhere, and our phone is constantly buzzing and our watch is going off, and there's all these inputs, listening is really hard. But I will tell you this, as a hostage negotiator, I never talked anybody into doing what I wanted them to do. I listened them into doing what I wanted them to do. How did I do that? I found out what motivated them. How did they get in this situation? How can we get them out of this situation, saving as much face as possible? How can I understand how they got to where they are so that we can craft a solution that they'll actually do and feel like it was their idea? So, how do we listen today? Active listening is everything. Rapport is the secret sauce. Remember, I mentioned that. You have got to build rapport with people at work. Even your clients and customers. We do business with people we like, know, and trust. If I don't feel like I know you, I don't have a chance to like you, and I'm not going to trust you. Okay? So you've got to build rapport with people. How do you do that? You paraphrase back to them what they're saying. Not word for word, but you're saying, what I hear you saying is this, this, and this. Is that correct? That accomplishes two things. If I'm going to paraphrase back to you, it requires me to listen. I can't make it up, okay? I have to actually be actively involved in the listening. And it allows you to check for understanding. If I say back to you, what I heard you say was this, this, and this, is that correct? That gives you the chance to say, that's not really what I meant to say at all, and then you'll clarify. Because I will tell you, as a negotiator, I knew one thing: time was always on my side. I wanted them to talk as long as they could possibly talk. Because it helps right the teeter-totter. It helps bring logic and reason back into the conversation. So I'm paraphrasing back to them to check for understanding. I'm also giving minimal encouragers. I'm doing things like saying on the phone, okay, I understand, tell me about that. Why? Tell me how that happened. I'm asking them to continue talking. Minimal encouragers are huge. As a professional speaker, I speak all over the country. I find the people in the audience who are nodding, who are tracking along, because sometimes you feel like nobody's listening, and then you find that one person, you're like, okay, this is making sense. And if it's not, I got to rewind and say something different, right? If I'm not getting those type of things, it's because I'm not saying it in a way that people will understand. So I'm looking for minimal encouragers as somebody who's speaking. And it encourages me to keep talking. I was asked to speak at a inner city fundraiser early in my speaking career. And I was given 20 minutes for my presentation. And when my wife and I arrived, we were the only white people in the room, and it didn't bother me a bit. But I will tell you this, I wasn't prepared for the audience. Because when I said about 2 sentences, I got my first amen. And I was like, oh, you like that? I got more of that. And we went for 40 minutes. I was supposed to talk for 20. We went 40 minutes, and nobody in the room was mad but my wife. Right? Because we were raised in a church that you set a time and you were done at that time. And this group was like, it was a conversation. My point is, their minimal encouragers encouraged me to keep talking, and they got more than a normal audience would get. Minimal encouragers, when you're talking to people, encourage them to keep talking. You're asking open-ended questions. Thank you. I got my first amen. There's more Chick-fil-A in the back if you need more, right? You're asking open-ended questions. If you are getting bad answers, I guarantee you are asking bad questions. Those of you with kids in the room, what's a horrible question? How was school? Because what do they say? Fine. What'd you do today? Nothing. Well, tomorrow's a new day. You'll be there for 7 hours. Maybe you'll do something tomorrow, right? Those are the conversations you have with teenagers. What's a better question? What was a surprising thing that happened at school today? Who'd you sit with at lunch? What's the drama? Spill the tea. Those are the better questions today that are going to get you better answers. So if you're like, well, nobody's communicating at work, it might have to do with your questions. You're emotionally labeling. This is huge in a crisis. Now be careful with this, because this is Jedi mind trick level communication here. If you want to make somebody mad, tell them how they feel. Okay? But if you want to move them out of the lizard brain quickly, because the lizard brain has no logic and reason, you are fight or flight survival mode. If you want to move them out of the lizard brain, encourage them to label their emotions. How do you do that? You say things like, well, it sounds like that was frustrating for you. It's not frustrating, I'm angry. Okay, they just labeled it. That part of their brain has now turned off if they were on a scan, and they've moved to the logical part of their brain. They've done studies on this. It's fascinating research. I encourage you to look into it, because when we label emotions, it's no longer a survival situation. We now have a file to put it in. But don't tell them how they feel. Say things like, you sound, or I can see where that might make you angry, or I can see where you could be sad about that. And they'll clarify, I'm not sad, I'm just frustrated. So emotional labeling moves them to a reasonable part of their brain. And then at the end, you're disclosing similar experiences. Don't do this in the beginning. They won't hear it, nor do they care. You might have somebody call you and just yell at you for 20 minutes and hang up. If you didn't yell back, your next conversation with them will be better. It just will. I used to have people threaten me when I arrested them and took them to jail, and I told new recruits to be nice to people. Anybody in here a Roadhouse fan, Patrick Swayze? I love Patrick Swayze. I'm like, be nice. And you can nicely take somebody to the ground, and you can nicely take somebody and put them in handcuffs, and you can nicely put them in your car. Why? Because I was standing in line at Wendy's one day, seeing a guy in front of me I had arrested the night before who actually threatened me if he saw me the next day. And here I am at Wendy's holding my baby on my hip. He turned around and he recognized me, and he looked at me and he goes, I was a big jerk last night. I was drunk. You were super nice. And I'm sorry. Cool. Had I been a jerk back to him, what would he have remembered me as? We can't control how they treat us. We are only ever in control of how we treat other people. So while you're listening, you're also thinking about what they're dealing with, their frustration, their level of anxiety, and you're helping to mitigate that just simply by letting them get it out. And then you can start talking about how we solve this problem. And maybe they just want to let you know, and you can say, I'm so glad you let me know about this, because we needed to know this information. The only way you got that is you listened. Here's the problem. This takes time. Anybody in here come in here tonight with an extra amount of time you didn't know what to do with? Probably not. But I will tell you this, you can invest the time today to listen to that employee, that team member, or that customer, or you can deal with it over and over and over again. So time invested today will prevent these crises in the future. This is why I do what I do. That's my whole world in one pic, just so you know. And that picks in here for a couple of reasons. One, it's my family, it's my presentation. I like to see their pictures. I travel the country. But two, this is why I try to be as intentional as I possibly can with my communication. This is why, because these people need my best. That's my little kayaker there in the red, by the way. This picture was last year when I added a son to the family. I'm a huge fan of getting a son at 22 years old, by the way. We only raised girls at our house. I know all the dumb things my brothers and I did before we were 22. I didn't have to walk through that with him. I got a fully formed son at 22, and I'm a big fan, okay? But these people need me to communicate effectively. They need me to listen. They need me to just be present with them. And here's what I want you to know. They could be in your business. They could be crossing paths with you. And if it's not them, it's somebody else's world. That cantankerous customer, that difficult employee that's giving you a hard way to go is super frustrating. That's somebody's everything, who really is counting on you to be a good listener, to help them solve the problems that they haven't been able to figure out on their own. And I don't know about you, but I generally solve problems by talking through them with somebody else. They may not even offer a solution, but verbalizing it out loud to somebody else puts it in a different area of my brain and allows me to connect the dots better than if I just sat and stewed on it. And my wife and I play a fun game called Here's What I'm Thinking, right? Because we like to catastrophize, both of us. So, here's what I'm thinking. We can't get a hold of our daughter right now. She's probably dead in a ditch somewhere. Just wanted to say that out loud, because in your head it's a certainty, isn't it? When you say it out loud, you can laugh about it to somebody who is actively listening to you. And then it becomes not quite as scary. Maybe they're just getting that out of their head because it's taking up too much brain space. You allowing them to do that gets them back to work quicker and allows them to be more productive. And they like, know, and trust you better. And they'll stay working at your company a whole lot longer because they feel like they matter. It may not be my why that's working with you, but it's somebody's why. And I would encourage you to have a picture like this at your workplace, because some days are worse than others, aren't they? And some days you're like, why am I doing this stupid job? That's why. And it's not really about the money or the status or whatever it is. It's about making this world a little bit better for those that are coming after you, isn't it? And you do that by listening. Every negotiation situation I went into, I wanted to listen way more than I talked. And I can't tell you the people who have thanked me afterwards because nobody in their life had listened to them. Which tells me, had somebody listened to them earlier, it may not have become my job. We might have avoided the situation altogether. So I believe firmly in the power of listening. I believe that you will listen more solutions than you will give solutions. And you will do that effectively if you remember what we talked about today and why the silence feels like we don't care. We're going to do questions and answers here in a minute. This is how you get a hold of me. I'm pretty easy to find online. That is my personal cell phone number. Feel free to use that. That QR code will take you to a site for the book. I won't necessarily take you to my contact stuff, but I will tell you this, that is my email, that is my cell number. Call me, text me, ask me questions you have. If bringing this content to your organization makes sense for you, we can talk about that. I have books in the back. I will tell you that we are not dependent upon book sales in order to fund our lifestyle. But we did just pay for a wedding a year ago, and our youngest is in college. So, $15 at a time, you can help support the Harvey kids. Last thing, I believe not only in listening, but I believe in telling a good story. And I believe so much in telling a good story that in July I'm hosting my own event right here in Central Kentucky called the Story Distiller Workshop. It's a one-day event that will teach you how to tell an impactful story so you can drive company culture, so that you can create an epic story that your family is excited to be a part of, or up into and including speaking from stages for a living. If that's something you've ever wanted to do, or you just want to tell a better story at work to drive company culture, I'd love to talk to you about that as well. Craig, I know we have questions and answers. That's just kind of a touch base point on what we talked about, and happy to answer any specific questions you have.
This is fascinating to me.
It's right there behind you.
This is fascinating to me. I could really sit and listen to this all night long. And before we have Q&A, I want to remind you again, we really do need your insight in things that you think would be good for us to have in 210 leaders for going forward. So Kurt's got a microphone, and he wants to take it to anybody. We're recording this, so he wants to take it to anybody that has a question. And so just raise your hand up, and Kurt will come around and hand the mic to you. But while you all are thinking about your question, and I know some of you, I can see some of you really thinking really hard, I have a question for you.
Okay.
And today I was reading about communication, thinking about tonight, and we have a series here called Being People Smart, which I've been studying here for about 6 months. But I read that a survey done in the last few years said 96% of the people surveyed that they were a good listener.
Yeah.
And so, you have any thoughts about that?
I do, and it tells you, I guarantee you that was an American survey, because we like to really overestimate our abilities on certain things in this country. But I will tell you, I would be interested if they repeated that survey with your coworkers and or your family. What would they say? How would they rate your listening? Because we think we're doing a great job of listening because we heard it. You physically it entered your ears does not mean you were listening. And I'm guilty of this myself. I'm preaching to the choir. I'm very good at saying the right thing at the right time and not having any idea of what you said. Okay, so we have to physically be involved. So because I heard it doesn't mean I'm listening. So, but I think if you ask people, they're going to say, yeah, I'm a really good listener. People come talk to me. So I would love to see that repeated with the people who surround those 97%.
Well, I also read one that said 10%. So, you know,
Yeah.
The beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, and the 3% didn't hear the question. So, you know.
Okay, does anybody have a question? Oh, come on, man.
Well, you scared one off. You said you're going to record your question.
Yeah, here we go, right here.
Here you go.
Drew's got a question.
So it's kind of a two-part question. One is, what do you think drives the bad listening in our culture? And then if that's what drives it, what is your number one practice that you do that made you begin to be a better listener?
It's a great question. And I think why this is an epidemic proportion is because we are being asked to process way more information than any generation has ever processed before. Our great-grandparents knew the stories of about a dozen people, close family and neighbors. They didn't know the stories of somebody on the other side of the continent that did something cool or scary or fun. And so we're being inundated with all this stuff, and our reticular activating system, the part of our brain that filters out the stuff that's unimportant, starts filtering all of that stuff out. And the important things get caught up in that RAS because we've told it that I don't need to know all that stuff. And so we don't listen like we should. And I think, how do we fix that? I think we understand, when we start to understand the power of being a good listener and how that will actually make you way more successful than being a good talker will, then I think we start to harness that power and we start to cue in on that and we start to minimize distractions as much as we can today. It's not entirely possible, but as much as we can. I always love if I went into somebody's office to ask them a question if they closed their laptop, if they were working on a laptop, if they closed it and looked at me. Then I'm like, now I'm more likely to tell you exactly what's going on. If you continue typing away while I'm talking, I'll wait until you finish. And if you don't finish, then I'm going to ask you something trivial and I'm out, because you're obviously not listening. So, making a point of giving them their face, asking follow-up questions, taking notes if you need to, just to communicate that you are listening, to keep them talking, which does take time, and I get that. But like I said, you invest it now or later. But I think the RAS is so much busy filtering out all the noise that it catches things that actually are important, if that makes sense.
What suggestions would you have for not just one-on-one, but you have 3, 4, 5, 6 people in a conversation? How do what do you notice as the group gets a little larger and the dynamics of that?
It is hard, and I will say, I think it's Michael Hyatt that has something he calls the one conversation rule. When he's at a dinner party, there's only one conversation happening, and we all can participate, but there's not side conversations, and that's hard. And I think when you've got multiple people involved, especially if you're higher up the food chain of these people that are talking, the more you can let them talk, the more you'll understand a little bit of what's going on, and you'll be able to, as the leader, step in appropriately when needed. But if you can encourage those people to keep talking before you say anything, if it's a staff meeting or something like that, before you pitch the new idea, ask them for their ideas before you pitch yours. Because once we pitch ours as the leader, then most of them are just going to come on board and not share their idea. So I think encouraging people to get their ideas out before we share ours, asking good questions so that conversation keeps going. And in a conference environment, when I meet somebody for the first time at a conference, I am telling them almost nothing about me, and I'm asking them tons of questions about them. And they will remember that as me being a really nice guy, because I was focused on them, and they're an expert on them. I didn't ask them anything they didn't know. They're happy to talk in their area of expertise. So the more we can ask questions and get people talking, the more productive that time will be. I don't know how well that answers your question or not.
Well, and also just how do you make sure it's a safe space for people to have a conversation?
That's a good question. And I will tell you, not only in the hostage negotiation world, but in the DARE world, when I would ask a question of a kid and they would give me an answer, I would always say, I love that answer. Tell me why you got to that. Tell me why you think that. If I don't say I love that answer or I agree with you first, if I just say, tell me why you say that, it becomes a defensive conversation. And they feel the need to defend. If I say, I like what you had to say there, tell me how you got there, I've just kicked their brain into a higher level of thinking, and they feel safe enough to share that. So you praise them for offering that solution or that thing, and then you ask why they got there. Because, as Roderick told us last time, if you were here, we get in trouble when we start assuming negative intent. When they say something that challenges something we're doing, we want to see it as a threat. When you say, I kind of like that, tell me how you got there, and now I understand where that came from. They're genuinely trying to help. They don't have the information that I have, but I understand how you got to that, and now I can understand a little bit more about why you said what you said, if that makes sense. So make it okay for them to continue talking by thanking them, praising them. I don't like praising because it sounds like good boy, good girl, and I don't like that. But I love that you shared that. Tell me why you did. Tell me why that's important to you.
That was great. I've got a question on commitments that come out of communication. So when you talk through something and there's some action, right? Is it more effective, would you even use it all to summarize some of the stuff in an email so you've got to follow up and redo it? Or is it more effective for you to tell them to summarize their commitments and my commitments and send it to me? Does it make sense?
It does make sense.
On the same page.
Yeah. And if we had had more time, I would have gone into how I use email. I use email to set up phone calls. Because I'm a professional speaker, they need to hear that I can string a sentence or two together. And I know we can accomplish more in a 5-minute phone call than we could on 6 email exchanges. So what do I do after that phone call? I pull up an email and I will email them what we said basically to check for clarity and to say, this is what you said you would do, this is what I said I would do, are you cool with that? And I hit send. Because that allows the print to complement what we had on the phone, and it leaves it not as much up to interpretation. But also, it allows me to have a searchable record of a phone call. I can't search my phone for a phone call, but I can search my phone for an email about that conversation that we had, and it just gives more clarity. So I tend to use email as a follow-up to phone calls, or when I meet you at a conference and you give me a business card, probably before the day's up, you're going to get an email from me. Oh, so good to meet you today. I love that your kid is doing that thing that you said, and I fire that off so that I'm first to follow up, and I've got something in there to remind me the next time I email them of what we talked about. So I create a record of the conversations as much as I can with my email. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Okay, one last question. Here we go. Jay over here. Okay, you get all right, be careful here. This is a professor.
I know.
So we got to be really careful.
I'm ready for the trap.
So it's kind of like I'm kind of setting the stage here for good communication because.
This is before I say something. Okay. No, I appreciate it, Scott. This is very helpful information that you've learned a lot to help you in your business interactions. I'm asking the question about how have you been able to teach other people to be good listeners, whether it's in the family or in a business situation. Perhaps there's somebody who likes to talk a lot and is not a good listener and is creating conflict. How have you been able to take what you've learned and empower someone or shift them to be able to practice what you're teaching them?
I think, it's getting somebody to do something they don't want to do is very, very difficult. That was my job as a negotiator. They didn't want to come out. So it's very difficult, and it's not going to happen immediately. I would tell you that they developed these habits of not listening over years. And so it's going to take a lot of training to teach them how to work their way out of that. And sometimes, like if it's a family member, especially if it's a kid, you just have to be there for when their way doesn't work. Like you've tried to tell them, and so now you need to go and do this thing on your own, and I'll be there when it doesn't work to help you find a way that might. I'll offer my suggestions and that kind of stuff. But I think encouraging people to ask questions, encouraging family members to ask questions at appropriate times. If I'm your parent, I tell you to do something, I need you to do it. Later on, we can talk about why we did what we did. That was my rule at the police department too with the new recruits. Like if I tell you to do something, I need you to do it. Later that evening or that day, you can ask me why we did that, but it might be a time-sensitive thing that I need you to do right away. And then we can talk about the why later. I will tell you the younger generations are more concerned with why. My generation and older, we were just told to do it and that was enough. And now they want a why, and that seems threatening to us. Well, why do you need a why? Because they want to feel like they're a part of the mission. So later on, we talk about why we did what we did so that the next time they'll do it without asking. They'll just do what we expect them to do because now they have a why, if that makes sense. So encouraging them to ask good questions at appropriate times helps people become better listeners.
Okay, thank you. So let me kind of end. One of my takeaways from tonight is that you started kind of with this, that I wrote down here, if you want to be respected more, listen more.
Yes, for sure.
And it's like that, when I wrote that down, it just really helped me think about the challenge that I really need to listen. If I want to be respected more, I need to listen more. And that is not my normal way of thinking, especially for you that are grinning right now and know me. So I see many people grinning, and then I saw several laughing. So it is like thank you for helping me with that.
To be fair, though, there is a lot to be gained from external processors like Craig and myself. I process things externally, but what you have to know about people like us is the first few things we say have really nothing to do with the problem. We're just getting it out. We're vomiting out what we're thinking, and we'll get to the solution eventually. My wife is more of an introverted processor, which means she will say nothing for hours and then spit out one sentence like Yoda that sums the essence of everything she's been stewing, and it'll be beautiful. I get there about 4 paragraphs later like Craig does.
Yeah, well, that's the difference between an extrovert and an introvert, which we're going to talk about that here as we go forward here for a second. So, thank you, Scott.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Yep.
Make sure you get a book. Please make sure you get a book. You know.